All rise.
Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. This Honorable Superior Court for the County of Wake is now convened and sitting for the regular dispatch of business. The Honorable Judge Paul C. Ridgway, President and presiding. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. God save the statements on the record. Please be seated and remain quiet. All cell phones and electronic devices must be silenced at this time. Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning, sir. Thank you very much.
Welcome back. So before we bring jurors and move on with the closing arguments, I sent a edited copy of the jury instructions out late yesterday afternoon. Were there any further objections, comments, or concerns about those instructions?
No, sir. Just to be clear, you'll be referring to Miss Allen as LaTanya Holden throughout, because that's how it was written in the...
Right. I think the first time that I reference her name, I'll explain that.
Yes, sir.
I'll just briefly say that she now goes by LaTanya Allen, but that I'll refer to her as LaTanya Holden for the purposes of consistency.
And I don't have anything further.
Very well. Mr. Brown and Ms. Hamburger, did you have any concerns about the instructions?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. All right, anything else that we need to take up before we bring jurors out and proceed with closing?
Just to let you know, we are going to do two. I'll open the closings, and then Mr. Lively will finish. Plan to use the projector for a PowerPoint. There are no photographs that would cause any issue. I believe Mr. Brown and Ms. Hamburger have already viewed my portion of the PowerPoint anyhow. So.
All right, very good.
You quickly saw that there were no photographs on it.
All right. And Mr. Brown, Ms. Hamburger, you'll be splitting your closing argument. Who will be going first?
I will.
All right.
They're not gory.
I will. Okay.
How long the arguments are, and I can tell you I don't really have a good estimate of my own, but do you have sort of a thought about when we'd be taking breaks during the arguments?
Well, we could... I wouldn't anticipate the opening being particularly long.
It may be 30 minutes.
All right. It may be that we want to take a break after, let's see, Ms. Hamburger's portion, and before we move into yours. That might be a logical breaking point. If we're at about an hour and a half would be an appropriate time, anywhere between an hour and a half, to give the jurors a break. All right. All right. Let's bring jurors out, please. Mentioned that it's my practice to give jurors a copy of the printed instructions as I read them so that they can follow along, and then they'd be permitted to take those instructions into the deliberation room. Either of you have a comment or a concern about that practice?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Thank you.
Which background?
And gentlemen, welcome back. As I mentioned yesterday, all of the evidence in this case has been presented, and it is now time for the closing arguments of the lawyers. At the conclusion of these arguments, I'll instruct you on the law in this case, and then you'll be asked to begin your deliberations. The final arguments of the lawyers are not evidence, but are given to assist you in your evaluation of the evidence. The lawyers are permitted in their final statements to argue, to characterize the evidence, and to attempt to persuade you to a particular verdict. It's improper for a lawyer in a final argument to become abusive, to inject personal experience, to express a personal belief in the guilt or innocence of the defendant, or to make arguments on the basis of matters outside of the record of this case. A lawyer may, however, on the basis of the lawyer's analysis, argue any position or conclusion with respect to any matter at issue. Now, in the course of making a final argument, a lawyer may attempt to restate a portion of the evidence in this case, and if the lawyer's recollection of the evidence differs from your recollection of the evidence, you are to be guided exclusively by your own recollection of the evidence in this case. In this matter, we will hear first arguments from the state, then we will hear arguments from the defense, and then the state will have the final argument in this case. So first we'll hear from Mr. Waller on behalf of the state.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. I'd like to start with this slide because I think it reminds us why we're all here. It's the state of North Carolina versus Nathan Holden. It's not LaTanya Allen versus Nathan Holden. It's not Sylvester Taylor versus Nathan Holden. It's not Anglia Taylor versus Nathan Holden. It's the state of North Carolina versus Nathan Holden. You've seen LaTanya. You've seen her brother, Sylvester Jr. T. You've seen their son, or his son, LaTanya's son, JT, testify. Good people, nice people. But I put this up here at the very beginning to remind us that this is about seeking justice and holding this defendant accountable for his actions. And the same would be true if we were in a courtroom east of 95 or if we were in a courtroom out in the mountains. The same law, the same burden of proof, the same standards apply to this defendant as they would any defendant here in North Carolina. And the same protection for the victims in the case. The purpose of my closing argument is going to be to give you a timeline. To kind of sum things up for you a little bit. As we've said from the very beginning, the state of North Carolina has the burden of proof in this case. And what that means is that we have to prove this case to you using witnesses and evidence. And it would be very nice if we could just call one investigator up there and say, you know, I did this on this day, I did this on another day, and just give you that summary. But that's not how the law works. You have to hear from each individual person that had a part in this case. Hear from them and have the defense have the opportunity to cross-examine them. So I know at times it may seem disjointed in terms of how we present the case, but I hope you also understand that that's what we have to do under the law. But it is my goal at this time, my purpose at this time, to give you a timeline, to help you maybe see how things progressed over the course of time from December of 2013 until April 9th of 2014. But before that, I want to remind you of something else. That these three people are the victims in this case. LaTanya, Sylvester, and Anglia. There's LaTanya after she came out of the hospital. And her brother, Sylvester Jr. Uncle T, as I'll probably call him here in a few minutes. They're the real victims in this case. In going first, you have to kind of anticipate what the defense may argue to you. And one thing that I anticipate, and I could be wrong, is that somehow this man, Sylvester Taylor, had a part in bringing on his own demise on the night of April 9th of 2014. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing could be further from the truth. You have heard zero evidence that that man, Sylvester Taylor, had a gun that night. You have heard zero evidence that the defendant thought he had a gun that night. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, Sylvester Taylor did everything in his power under the law in cooperating with law enforcement, in cooperating with the Department of Social Services to prevent this from happening. So to blame him or to say that he is somehow responsible for this defendant's actions is far from the truth. I'm sure he was mad. If you remember back to jury selection, we talked a lot about how things that maybe happen to others, your other loved ones, your children, or your siblings, how those can affect you even more than if it happened to yourself. That's Sylvester Taylor's baby girl. And you better believe he was probably mad on January 1st when the defendant came over or was threatening to come over and get the kids. It's his baby girl. But did he shoot him? Did he say, come on over here and get you some? We'll fight it out? No. He called the police and asked, what do I do if this guy that is threatening my family comes onto my property? So don't buy it. If they come up here and argue to you that somehow Sylvester brought this upon himself, nothing could be further from the truth. The timeline. We'll start in very general terms. December 7th of 2002, the defendant and LaTanya were married. December of 2013 is when the broom incident happens, where the defendant beats his son, JT, with a broom. And as you heard LaTanya say, that was kind of the last straw for her. You know, I can take a lot, but when you bring my children into this, when you start subjecting them to this type of pain, that's enough. So she leaves on December 20th of 2013, and she goes and moves in with her parents there at Lake Glad Road, the address you've heard a lot about during the course of this trial. Moves in with them. And then January 1st, you hear about that incident in which things seem to start going south. It's almost like, okay, LaTanya left on the 20th. I got to spend some time with him on Christmas Day, but things start to get real on January 1st. And the defendant calls threatening to come pick the children up. And again, Sylvester doesn't say, okay, let's fight this out. He calls the police and says, what should we do? And the police advise LaTanya to go down and get a restraining order and file for custody the next day. And that's what she does. But something happens as she's going down there. You heard from Sylvester Taylor Jr., T, how he had a good relationship with the defendant, tried to be a mentor, a brother to him, loved him. He was away serving his country, but tried to stay in constant contact with the family. And he told you how on the morning of January 2nd of 2014, he knew that something was wrong. That he gets this text from the defendant. I'm about to react. I'm sorry. And then, as you see, State's Exhibit 45 is the list of texts, and then State's Exhibit 46 is the phone log itself. And what I will say at this point is I believe Judge Ridgway will instruct you at the end of all the arguments that once you go back there in the deliberation room, that if you want to see any of this, if you want to see text or phone logs or pictures or hear phone calls or watch videos, all you have to do is ask. But he gets this text, I'm about to react, I'm sorry. Then he hears fuck it, or sees fuck it. And so T's thinking, what in the world is going on here? He calls the defendant, there's no response. But then the defendant calls back a few minutes later, and he makes that statement. If I can't have them, no one will. Foreshadowing things to come. T is obviously very upset about this, frantically tries to get in touch with LaTanya, and you see there from the slide, makes 10 failed attempts to get in touch with LaTanya, but finally gets in touch with her on the 11th call at 11:01 a.m. In the meantime, he reaches out to his father, Sylvester Taylor Sr., and tells him about the threats and the concern that he has, not only for LaTanya, not only for the kids, but for the defendant. He's concerned about everybody at this point. And then you heard that Sylvester Taylor Sr. contacted law enforcement, and that threat was relayed to LaTanya. And if you recall, nothing you can do now, it's over. What did T tell you? He thought his sister was dead at that point. January 2nd of 2014, from the perspective of LaTanya. She has the kids at this point. She goes to drop them off to school. They've had the altercation the day before. She sees the truck there and she knows it's going to be a bad day. She goes to school, sees that truck, gets her father involved, and he helps drop the kids off. She does exactly what the officer told her to do the next day. And even broader than that, she does what any mother would do that is truly in fear for her children. She goes to the courthouse. She runs down there and tries to start the paperwork to get custody of her kids, to get this man away from her. And when she does that, she gets that text. What floor are you on? So she immediately knows the defendant is there and has followed her to the courthouse. You then hear about the confrontation that they had in the parking deck where he boxes her in with his truck, yells at her, puts his finger in her face. Anger. On January 2nd of 2014. She's able to get out of the parking deck and doesn't get very far at all when the defendant runs her off the road with his truck. She can't go anywhere then, so she says, okay, let's go to this parking lot here, and we'll try to talk some more. And at that point, when she's trying to pay her money to park, he gets in her face, puts his fist up against her face, and threatens to punch her in the stomach, all because she won't talk to him. Berates her in front of the courthouse, and finally she says, just let me get something to eat. Let's go get something to eat and we can talk about this. And you heard during the course of them leaving the downtown area where she's trying to get away from him, that's when she receives the phone call from the school resource officer saying what T had relayed to the father, that he was concerned, that there were concerns about the safety of the children and her. She goes back and she's able to get away from the defendant driving through downtown, runs into the courthouse, and you heard from Sergeant Welch and Deputy Bell about how when she came in she was frantic and upset, and she's actually able to finally get that domestic violence protective order that orders the defendant to stay away from her and gives her custody of the kids. And you can take a look at that domestic violence protective order on State's Exhibit 53. You can see that it was served on the defendant on January 3rd. You'll recall that Deputy Broadwell, who knew LaTanya from growing up with her, going to school with her, and was also, ironically, the first officer that reached LaTanya on the night of April 9th, that he assisted in a custody exchange, or attempted to. The defendant never even showed up that night. But at that point, Deputy Broadwell advised her that she should get a gun. He could tell the situation was toxic at that point. January 21st, the domestic violence protective order is granted for a year, giving LaTanya custody of all 3 children, with the defendant having weekend visitation privileges. You can see from State's Exhibit 50, not only is he ordered not to have contact with LaTanya, but he's also ordered not to have a gun. And I want to point something else out to you about this January 21st DVPO, that it's a consent order. And if you look at that document, both parties agree to this. They both say, yes, this is what we want. This is the custody situation we want. The defendant agrees to stay away from her. But then things change. And you've heard a lot about January 26th of 2014. That's the day where the custody exchange happens between Sylvester Taylor and then the defendant, his father, and his brother. This swap, where Sylvester, probably rightly so, felt intimidated. He's 1 man versus 3, and it's a contentious situation. But what did you hear from the defendant's own father yesterday? That Sylvester offered to shake the defendant's hand that day. That Sylvester and the defendant's father didn't have any issues. That they did shake hands. That they had a conversation. It's only when the defendant starts acting up that Sylvester decides that it's time that he needs to get out of there. And he takes the kids, as he was rightfully allowed to do, and he goes back to Lake Glad. And then, yes, something does happen between JT and Sylvester. He's a 14-year-old boy. His grandfather has just told him to get off of his phone, which is probably his most prized possession in his life at that point. And they get into it. And whether he slapped the phone away from him or actually slapped his face, at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't matter because there was never a gun involved. There's no evidence whatsoever that that Sylvester actually pulled a gun on JT. JT admitted from that witness stand that no, there was never a gun. I said it because I thought if I said it, I would get to stay with my dad, and that's what I wanted to do to help keep the peace. And then this threat of Sylvester, this monster Sylvester, don't you believe, ladies and gentlemen, that if Sylvester had brandished that weapon there at that McDonald's, that the defendant's father and brother would have told you about that? The best they can tell you is that there was a bag underneath the seat. He never threatened them. Monday, January 27th, JT alleges a gun to the defendant, school personnel, and Kathy Suithall. Tuesday, January 28th, Mr. Taylor, Mrs. Taylor, and LaTanya voluntarily sign a safety plan. They invite Kathy Suithall into their house the very next day at, I believe she said 8:30 in the morning, said, come in, here are my guns, what do I have to do to get rid of them so we can get our children back? They followed the process. They followed the law. And they signed that safety plan, agreeing to take all the guns off the property. But then on Thursday, January 30th, the defendant files for emergency custody of children based on the 126 incident. And that gives the defendant custody of the 3 kids. I've put emergency in quotes there. If the defendant was so scared for his children, on January 26th. Why didn't he go over there and try to help? There was a DVPO in place. His brother said that the Lord stopped him from doing it, that he didn't want to lose his job. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are so scared for your children's life or lives, you do everything in your power to go over there to help them. You pick up the phone, you call 911, and you say, my children are in trouble. Send a Wake County Sheriff's deputy to help me go check this out. And that's not what happened. And then, if you are so scared that your children are in danger, you do like LaTanya did. You run your butt down there to the courthouse the very next morning, and you go in front of a judge and you say, this is the situation. But that's not what he did. He didn't go on Monday. He didn't go on Tuesday. He didn't go on Wednesday. That court order was not filed until Thursday. How much of a threat do you really believe there was if he can't get down to the courthouse to file this paperwork until Thursday? 3 full days and into a 4th day later. And then on Monday, February 10th, that's when the custody arrangement was essentially finalized for the purposes of leading us to April 9th. And I want you to note that as of February 10th, the Taylors were ordered to remove all weapons from their house, and they voluntarily had complied with that. They came into court and said the guns are gone. What does that mean, ladies and gentlemen? As of February 10, 2014, this defendant was in that courtroom and heard that. He knew as of February 10th, these people were completely defenseless against him. You've heard that from Lexton Faison that during the separation period, JT texted Lexton and said, I believe my father is going to kill my grandparents. And then you have April 5th, JT's birthday. LaTanya decides not to go to the party. Completely reasonable decision. Wednesday, April 9th, 2014, from LaTanya's perspective. The defendant begins to call her in the early morning hours on her way to work, and she ignores it. She doesn't answer. She doesn't talk to him. She then tells you that about 3 or 4 times during the course of the workday, he calls her work. She doesn't answer him. She doesn't talk to him. She goes home feeling sick, doesn't go to church, and Glee and the girls go to church. She receives a text message from Terry Jones, who told you she's now Terry Williams. But Terry Williams told you, yeah, the defendant came by the church. JT was there. We weren't expecting him. We thought it was a little bit odd, so I texted LaTanya. Anglia returns home with the girls, and at 9:48 p.m., State's Exhibit 66, she makes that chilling 911 phone call where she says, my husband is here and he's shooting. He shot my father. JT's perspective, like we talked about in opening, he goes to school. His dad picks him up. Go to Holden Acres. And as they're leaving Holden Acres, his dad stops by the side of the road and picks that bag up and puts it between his legs. Hours and hours before he ever goes to 1125 Lake Glad Road. They go to Cousin Jason's house, and from there they go to Zion Hill Holiness Church where Anglia and the girls were, where LaTanya wasn't. Then they go to Sonic. And then the defendant asks JT, you want to go see your mom? And what happens next? JT goes into that house, followed shortly by his father. JT hears gunshots. His mother puts him and Nautica in the closet, and then Amber runs in after the gunshots have already started. JT is feet away from where he can hear his mother being beaten, where he can hear his mother being shot, where he can hear his mother saying, Jesus. The beating, the shooting stops, and the defendant opens the closet door, hands him a phone with 911 on the other end, and leaves his wallet. He says he loves them. But ladies and gentlemen, sometimes actions speak much louder than words. You then hear JT on the 911 call. And then you hear and you see JT and Amber and Nautica in the back of that patrol car. And you see the effect of what happened to them. You hear that they clearly identify without a shadow of a doubt that it was their father that came in and did this. By 12:06 a.m., the Chevy truck is located at Mr. Staten's house. By 12:56 a.m., CCBI searches Lake Glad. That's Agent Humphrey and Agent Lauder. And I know it was a lot of photographs, and I know some of it was tedious, but you needed to see it. And you also needed to hear that they looked around that house, in that house, on the property, in sheds, between them and Wake County Sheriff's Office, and they didn't find any weapons. They didn't find any firearms. By 2:53 a.m., the defendant is arrested out in that field. Deputy Stell has seized the gun that you saw. Agent Ferran is picking up shell casings. 8:10 a.m., they're back out at Lake Glad and Holden Acres, again searching for evidence. And they find that one gun. That one rusted out rifle behind the back seat of that S10 pickup that the deputy said appeared to be used as storage with him. That's it. And if you recall from the photographs, Mr. Taylor has certainly run past that S10 at that point, and there's no evidence that, one, that gun even worked, and two, that he ever was able to get to it. April 10th, LaTanya survives her heart surgery. And April 11th, less than probably 36 hours after he had shot and killed Anglia Taylor and shot and killed Sylvester Taylor and shot LaTanya, Lorna Haddix goes to visit with Mr. Holden, the defendant, to talk about placement of the kids. And on April 11th, less than 36 hours after this all took place, the defendant says they got what they deserved. What's done is done. April 11th, LaTanya has her face surgery. April 14th, they've got the medical examiner's report back, and they decide they need to go back out to Lake Glad to look for a few more shell casings, and they do find two more shell casings. The one behind the dresser and the one outside. April 15th, everything is sent off to SBI. And April 18th, LaTanya is able to be released from the hospital to attend the funeral of her parents and finally see her kids again. February 3rd of 2015, LaTanya is able to file for divorce. And on April 13th, just a few days past the year anniversary of this, LaTanya is able to get out of this nightmare of a marriage. But between those two dates, the defendant sends a letter. And LaTanya read part of it to you, and I want to read part of it to you again. Me and LaTanya's separation agreements was never intended to be a permanent situation. Due to some events that took place, this has allowed this separation to be longer than we agreed on. I am not willing to accept this divorce. Simply because of religious practice, there has been no time at all for us to get counseling and to try to talk about any issues. And simply, I do not have a reason as to why there should even be a divorce. We, as in Nathan and LaTanya Holden, both made a commitment of vows under oath in the temple in front of family and friends, standing before God, briefly stating that I am to be with, love, and cherish LaTanya Holden for the rest of my life, no matter what trials may come up against us, and to let no man break what God has joined together. So I pray that the courts do not break this bond of matrimony between LaTanya A. Holden and Nathan L. Holden. Ladies and gentlemen, again, I have to anticipate what I believe the defense may argue to you here in a few moments. Divorce is not easy. Many of you, in fact, all of you, said you at least knew someone that had been divorced. Some of you have gone through it yourself. It's not easy. Excuse my language, but it sucks. It's tough. You wake up one morning and the person that you spent a significant amount of time with is no longer there. Is no longer part of your life. And then when you add kids to the mix, it makes it even tougher. You have to decide as a person how you're going to handle this situation. I anticipate that you'll hear a lot about the defendant and how he loved his kids and how he loved his family and how he wanted his family back. Well, that wasn't in the cards anymore. That wasn't going to happen. So, as a person going through this, he had to choose whether or not he was going to accept this and make the best of it and truly love those kids. And not love in the sense of, hugging them and that sort, but putting them first. Understanding that the things had fallen apart between him and LaTanya, but that he could make the best of it by loving them and cherishing each moment that he had with his kids, whether it be every other weekend, whether it be 13 days, whether it be 30 days. That would be love, putting their needs first. That's not what this letter in this case has been about. It's about hate. It's about selfishness. It's about hating the people that have taken something from you and not being able to stand it. Hating LaTanya for leaving. Hating Sylvester and Anglia from keeping his family away from him in his eyes. So if they come up here and try to talk to you about that this was all about love and how much he missed his kids and how they just snapped, that's not what this is about. His actions, his choices were about hate. Hate for LaTanya and Sylvester and Anglia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Watson.
Ms. Hamburger, on behalf of the defense.
I woke up with a sore throat, so I'm going to use this to make sure that you can hear me. Good morning. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I don't know if any of y'all have read Anna Karenina, but maybe you've heard that quote before. It's the first line of Leo Tolstoy's famous novel about a tragic divorce. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Obviously, we are here today because something profoundly, profoundly unhappy happened within this family. And as we've gone through the process of jury selection and then evidence in this case, I've sometimes wondered if any of you have been surprised by what you've heard. Maybe we've watched too many Lifetime movies, but I think a lot of us coming in, hearing just the bare bones of the facts of this case, just maybe glancing at it or hearing about it in passing, a lot of us would make some assumptions about what the context was, about what the backstory was. I think a lot of us would assume that this is a story about a chronically abusive and violent relationship with a wife who eventually worked up the courage to leave her monstrous husband, that he then threatened her, stalked her, eventually attacked her. But that's not the story of this family's unhappiness. That Lifetime movie, it's not this case. It's not this family. It's not Nate Holden. What Nate did was an undeliberated, impulsive act. He didn't plan it. He didn't want it to happen. This goes against everything he has ever stood for. Family, being there for his kids, being a good husband, undergoing the most painful, most stressful experience of his life. Nate did snap. You've seen this photo. We showed it to you the other day. It's a bit confounding, isn't it? The contrast between this photo and the events of April 9th. How did this happen? First, I want to talk about Nate before all this happened. Now, Nate Holden is not perfect, and he doesn't claim to be. But he took his job as a husband and a father very seriously, and he did the very best that he could. JT testified very sincerely, very movingly, that he loves his father, continues to love him. LaTanya told you that this was a happy relationship at first. She said they were best friends. She said we could tell each other anything. And you have read Nate's personal notebooks, his journals. You got to put those journals in your hands. You got to leaf through those pages that he wrote. How often do we get a glimpse like that inside of someone else's head? So you know what was going on with him before the separation and afterwards. You saw that letter to Jeremy where he's a dad trying to use basketball as an analogy for life to help guide his teenage son. In other parts, he's planning for his family's financial security, thinking about his credit score, thinking about getting rid of debt. You can see so clearly that he really wants what's best for his kids. He wants to take care of his family financially. He's thinking about plans for the future, plans to open his own barber shop, plans for his dream house. The man who wrote those notebooks is a man who cares about his family. People are complicated. You saw that family binder. That was created prior to the separation. You saw the routine charts, the meal plans. You saw Nate's handwriting in there, and you also saw LaTanya's. These were two parents doing their best, working together for their family. Those are the parents of this photo. And that's not to say that everything was perfect. It wasn't. But they were trying. They were both trying. Nate and LaTanya's relationship succumbed to the problems so many marriages succumb to. Troubles with in-laws, financial difficulties. You heard that they'd filed for bankruptcy. They had 2 children less than a year apart. That's hard. They were juggling work and children, and there was some infidelity. Very, very typical problems. And you can see from the notebooks that they had problems. You read the entries from the period in 2009, several years before this happened. And you can see that Nate was struggling, but you can also see his heartfelt commitment to facing the problems that they had as a couple. His desire to communicate even when he didn't feel like they were hearing each other. His commitment to keeping their marriage together despite the difficulties. And you can see that Nate's commitment to his family didn't wane with the separation. Remember the notebooks that we showed you yesterday, the notebooks and the binder, those were found by law enforcement officers in the home that they searched, that where Nate was living at the time that this happened on April 9th. And he had just moved into that house. That was not the home that he shared with LaTanya. He took that binder, he took those notebooks, and he deliberately moved them to the new place, and he put them right beside his bed. These weren't just old things that were hanging around that law enforcement found. These were things he wanted nearby, that he was keeping handy. This family binder that he and LaTanya put together, he had that right next to his bed. And he even had added to it, you could see in there that there was a flyer called Putting Children First, a booklet for families and transition. It looks like something he probably received during the custody dispute. Got it from the courts, probably. He wanted to help his children through the separation and custody issues, so he put that little flyer into his family binder. And you probably noticed that there are 2 notebooks. One was written prior to the separation, one was written after. And in the one that Nate wrote during the separation, you can see that he was working on lists of life goals. Some of them were, what he said was, always be in my kid's life. Another one was, get family back together. Another one, mentor son about life. And he lists his career goals, his financial goals. And this goes along with the testimony you heard about the renovations he was making to the house so that his family would have a nice place to live. Even during the separation, or maybe especially during the separation, he was always thinking about his family in a very sincere way. Now, you heard that his work on that house was maybe a little bit obsessive. He wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating, and even while he was writing these big plans in his notebook and working on the house, he was obviously suffering from serious emotional distress. His father said he was crying every day. His brother had never seen him cry before. You can see his heartbreak in the letter to LaTanya, written weeks before April 9th. This is in late March. He says, I've been doing really, really bad. In these letters, you can see where his thoughts were, where his mind was, where his heart was. And it wasn't on violence. You got the chance to read his innermost thoughts. Was there anything in there that was violent? Were there any threats? Were there any ideations about hurting anybody? It wasn't on violence. It wasn't on blame. In fact, he said, I'm not perfect. I'm to blame here too. It wasn't on anger. It was on his love for his family and a yearning need to reconcile with his wife. And maybe there's a touch of denial in there. Maybe you noticed that. But he was doing his best, the same way he was when he wrote that letter that Mr. Waller just read to you. So the violence of April 9th, 2014, that's not Nate Holden, not the real Nate Holden. We know the real Nate Holden from those writings. But how did Nate get from this to April 9th? Well, this case is about a family, and families are complicated. Family dynamics are complicated. What is a family but a group of individuals with their own personalities and flaws, their own strengths and weaknesses? Individuals who are bound together by strong but complicated bonds. And within this family, there were interpersonal dynamics that escalated the situation, turned it into something it didn't have to be. Tanya decided to leave right before Christmas. And you heard that things started off okay. They agreed, LaTanya said, to a plan to share custody. They even spent some time together over the holidays, which I'm sure was difficult, but they did that for their children. And up to this point, it seems like, and LaTanya even said, things were going all right. Yes, it was hard, but they were managing. They were putting their kids first. They weren't this couple anymore, but they were sort of like that couple who put the binder together, working together for their children. And of course there were strong feelings. As Mr. Waller said, divorce is one of the most difficult life experience people can face. Nate didn't want his marriage to end. That's not surprising. He still loved his wife. He wanted to be with his children all the time, not just some of the time. He thought he and LaTanya could work it out. And it was the holidays. Instead of celebrating with his family, his wife was moving out. And he was hurt, and he was angry. And some of those feelings, it sounds like, came out on January 1st. He was hoping for a return to normalcy. He was looking forward to getting his kids back to their regular school routine after the Christmas break. And he called LaTanya at the Taylors on January 1st and said he was coming to get the girls. And maybe he sounded stressed and irritable when he said it. Maybe he said it as a demand. But it wasn't an unreasonable request. They had agreed on joint custody. But for some reason, you know, these dynamics are hard right at the beginning of a separation. LaTanya resisted, and we don't know exactly why. She didn't say. And it became an argument. And then Mr. Taylor called the police. Now, if you were listening closely to LaTanya's testimony, you probably noticed that LaTanya didn't really explain why Mr. Taylor called the police. She and Nate were arguing. An argument that probably happens many times a day between separating couples all over the world. But you didn't hear LaTanya say that he threatened any violence. If he had done that in that January 1st phone call, don't you think LaTanya would have told us that? It was an argument about two parents who had agreed on joint custody and had not yet exactly figured out how that was going to work. Nate was upset about the separation. He was stressed. He said he was coming to get his kids, but they were his kids, and they had agreed on joint custody. So why did Mr. Taylor call the police? Well, from what we've learned about Mr. Taylor here in this courtroom, we know he had a temper. We know he had a habit of overreacting to situations, especially when they involved Nate. In a different family, with different personalities, this probably would not have escalated the way it did. But the next thing Nate knows, this argument he's having with his wife has turned into a police matter. The officer got on the phone with Nate and LaTanya. This is what LaTanya told us the other day. He got on the phone with them, and he told them that these situations go more smoothly, and it would go more smoothly if they had a joint custody agreement in place. Again, that's good advice, probably advice that lots of separating couples have received. And during that conversation with the officer, Nate and LaTanya agreed that they would meet at the courthouse the next day at 3 p.m. to settle the custody arrangements. But then LaTanya testified about what happened after she got off the phone with Nate. And what happened then was that the plan changed. Mr. Taylor told the officer that he didn't want Nate on his property, and he said he'd shoot him if he came around. Again, in retrospect, this seems like an overreaction, like it was more about Mr. Taylor's historical dislike of Nate than about anything that had happened that night. Nate was upset about an inherently stressful situation, but there was no clear reason to think he was dangerous. But Mr. Taylor's temper ruled the day. The officer changed his advice all of a sudden and told LaTanya that she should get a restraining order and seek full custody. Wait, what? Full custody? She's just been telling Nate that they were going to have joint custody. Anyone who's been through a divorce knows this is a big deal, the difference between full custody and joint custody. They just agreed to meet at the courthouse at 3 o'clock the next day to arrange the custody agreement. And now suddenly, after one argument, she's seeking not just full custody, but a restraining order. Nate must have suspected that she was backing out of the deal. He suspected that she was trying to beat him to the courthouse to get full custody. And the next morning, on January 2nd, he discovered that he was right. They'd agreed to meet at the courthouse at 3 o'clock, and here she was at the courthouse at 9:30. Naturally, he felt upset. He felt betrayed. Now, we heard a lot of testimony about January 2nd, so let's talk in more detail about that day. Around the time Nate discovered that Tanya had come to the courthouse earlier than planned, earlier than she had said she would, he texted Sylvester Taylor II, that's LaTanya's brother. I'm going to call him T for purposes of distinguishing him from Sylvester, his father. So whatever T and Nate had an exchange via text, and whatever Nate said made T nervous enough to call his father. And again, once Sylvester Sr. was involved, things escalated. Once again, Sylvester's overreaction to a situation made it worse. He called Jeremy's school, said that Nate was threatening to kill his children. The school resource officer called Tanya and told her that Nate was threatening to kill her. Naturally, LaTanya got scared, and based on that supposed threat, a whole cascade of events occurred. The restraining order was issued, and the whole situation escalated some more. And remember, the restraining order was issued ex parte. That's a legal term, which means that LaTanya went to the magistrate herself, and Nate did not have a chance to explain himself before it was issued. Importantly, he never got a chance to defend himself against this accusation that he had threatened to kill his family. It's a serious accusation. When you get back to the jury room, look very closely at the evidence concerning that January 2nd alleged threat. T testified that he had texted with Nate that morning, and you've seen those texts. You can look at them again, ask for them back in the jury room. They don't contain any threats to hurt anyone. Nate says, I'm about to react. And okay, you can see why that might make T nervous. But I'm about to react could just as likely mean he was going down to the courthouse. Maybe he was threatening to hire a lawyer. Maybe he was threatening to seek full custody. It's over. Other words that were in those text messages could just as easily refer to the marriage being over, the relationship being over. So those are the texts. When T got on the stand, though, he said that in addition to the text, he had a phone call with Nate. And that does appear to be true. Based on his phone records, there is a 3-minute phone conversation. T now claims that Nate told him during that conversation that if I can't have them, no one can. Frightening words. But in a hearing held in May 2014, just a few months after all of this happened, T failed to mention anything about that phone call, although he was given plenty of opportunity. He didn't even remember it. How important could the phone call have been if he didn't even remember it just a few short months later? And he admitted when I questioned him the other day that his recollection of the phone call is, as he put it, vague at best. In fact, he just recently told someone in the DA's office, according to their notes, that he didn't remember the contents of the call at all. Here's what probably happened. T and his father took I'm about to react in the worst possible light. They freaked out and initiated a game of telephone based on their fears, but not on reality. You've played that game of telephone, right? Where kids sit in a circle and you whisper in one kid's ear and then your message gets passed around, distorted as it goes. And you can tell that this was a game of telephone because the supposed threat keeps changing in every retelling. Tanya testified that she received a call from the officer saying that Nate was threatening to kill her. In the restraining order, it's that he's threatening to kill the kids and himself. Even more importantly, You can feel confident that there was no threat because Nate was not charged with any crime around this. The school resource officer who was involved in this game of telephone, he was a sworn law enforcement officer. He knew about that supposed threat. He's the one who conveyed it to LaTanya. But did you hear any evidence that Nate was charged with anything? Communicating threats is a crime. If that law enforcement officer wanted to, he could have charged Nate, but he didn't. And here's one more reason to doubt that the threat ever happened. Nate did not hurt anybody that day. He did have an angry confrontation with LaTanya, but he didn't hurt her, and he made no efforts whatsoever to hurt his kids. You heard just now Mr. Waller say that T's fears about that phrase, "it's over," made him fear that something terrible had happened. But it hadn't. Nothing bad had happened. By the afternoon, Nate's texting apologies to T. He says, "Thanks." And then he says, "I love all you guys. I just want to make it right. Just want to get it right, that's all, and be able to see and talk to my kids." That's Nate just a few hours later. If he was homicidal that morning, he calmed down very quickly. So there's no good evidence that this threat ever happened. Now, T is asked to testify at this trial, and he looks back at those texts and sees that there's no threat contained in those texts, right? The DA's probably pointed that out to him, and maybe he wonders why he and his father overreacted so much to those texts, and he figures it must have been the phone call. His faulty human memory fills in those blanks. So there's no threat, but it's true that Nate did confront LaTanya at the courthouse on January 2nd. She was going back on her agreement to joint custody. Of course he was upset. Taking someone's children away from them is just about the worst thing you can do to them. And you can see from Nate's notebooks how much of his identity was wrapped up in being a parent and being present for his children and being always there for them. January 2nd was certainly not Nate's finest moment, the confrontation with LaTanya. But you can start to see how this such situation escalated when it didn't necessarily have to, due to the particular people involved, their history, their personalities, their reactions. And I'm not saying that to blame anybody, but it provides critical context for what eventually happened within this family. The restraining order not only told Nate to stay away from LaTanya, it gave full custody of the kids to her, again, in an ex parte proceeding that he had no part of. Ex parte means that only LaTanya was present. And a few weeks later, Nate got a chance to be heard. And at that point, he decided to make a deal. He'd agree to the restraining order to stay away from LaTanya because that's what she wanted. And in exchange, he'd get some time with his kids. Every other weekend. This gave him every other weekend rather than LaTanya having full custody. And it wasn't a lot, but it was something. And here's another thing that heightened the tension. The restraining order triggered the Child Protective Services investigation. And again, remember, this restraining order is based on this threat, which we now think probably didn't happen, right? This threat to kill his family. That was probably the worst allegation in that restraining order. The restraining order is given by the clerk of court to Child Protective Services. And of course, when they see something like that, they're going to investigate. And maybe that investigation was even necessary. Who knows? Things were not perfect in this family. But I'm sure any parent would agree that having your parenting scrutinized by social workers would be extremely stressful, especially on top of everything else that Nate was going through, his emotional distress over the separation. And especially for Nate, whose parenting was such a huge part of his identity, as you can see from those notebooks. He felt judged. He felt scared that he would lose his children. Of course he had strong feelings about that. So now CPS is involved, and the courts are involved, and the kids are going back and forth. And then there was this custody exchange on January 26th. Sylvester Sr. showed up to get the kids, and Nate and his father-in-law were always a combustible mix. There was an exchange of words, but it was just words. Not even any yelling. Jeremy testified to that. And things escalated when they didn't need to because of Sylvester's tendency to overreact. When he got Jeremy home, he screamed at him, saying that he had set him up. by any standard, that is just completely inappropriate to say to a 14-year-old, to put him in the middle of some imaginary dispute between two adults. He slapped him, and we know there was a gun in the car. Sylvester showed that gun to Kathy Soothall. Jamal, Nate's brother, and his father both saw it, so it wasn't hidden in the way that Sylvester claimed it was. And surely JT knew the gun was in the car. A 14-year-old in a house with a lot of guns, he probably knew where the guns were kept. He probably knew what the bag looked like that his grandfather kept his gun in. An angry man with a bad temper and a gun nearby, in the car where the sight of this screaming and slapping occurred. Any 14-year-old would be scared. And we know he was really scared because he ran to a neighbor's house and he called 911. Now, maybe JT got nervous when the law enforcement actually arrived. Maybe reasonably, he didn't want his grandfather to get into trouble, so he downplayed it. And maybe he's downplaying it now because he wants to honor the memory of the grandfather he loved. Jeremy is, by his own admission, a peacekeeper. But it's more reasonable to assume that the first story he told was the true one, that Sylvester had a gun and JT was scared of him. And regardless of whether there was really a gun, the important thing is that's what Nate thought. His father and Jamal saw the gun at the custody exchange. Nate likely saw it too. And then JT told him minutes later that Sylvester had threatened him with it. Jeremy also repeated that story to several other people in addition to Nate, by the way. Any father would be scared. And as Mr. Waller likes to say, if you threaten to hurt me, I'm going to be upset. But if you threaten to hurt my kids, I'm going to be really upset. So Nate hired an attorney and filed for emergency custody as soon as he could figure out what to do. And it's to his credit that he did not go there and get into a confrontation with Sylvester on that evening. And probably one of the factors was he knew Sylvester had a lot of guns. The January 2nd and January 26th incidents are two obvious examples of the way this situation escalated, all due to the personalities and reactions of the individuals involved. A combustible mix. An unhappy family, unhappy in its own very tragic way. Nate wanted his life back. He was heartbroken at the loss of his marriage. He was afraid for his children's safety. He was frightened he might lose his children based on the CPS investigation. He felt judged by the social workers. But through all that, you've read Nate's own words. You've read them in that notebook, in his letters to LaTanya from late March 2014. Those are the words of a heartbroken man, but they are not the words of a man plotting murder. What happened on April 9th, 2014 was not planned. It was not deliberated. Mr. Brown is going to talk to you in more detail about what happened that night, and he will urge you, as I do, to find Nate not guilty of first-degree murder. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and take a 15-minute recess at this time. When we return, we'll hear the second half of the defense argument from Mr. Brown, and then we'll hear the final argument from the state. Please recall all the instructions I've given you. Leave your notepads in your chairs. Gather in the deliberation room at 11 o'clock. Everyone else, please remain seated. We'll be in recess until 11 o'clock.
Court stands in recess until 11 o'clock. Thank you.